All right, maybe we didn't let.
Okay.
We're gonna do, we ready to go?
You know how beginning of our meeting we do
I love being early, and
All right, we're going to get started in just a minute, maybe 1 or 2 minutes from now.
Actually running for...
All right, we're going to get started with the meeting here, and I wanted to just, before we get started, invite, Joanna to introduce herself and say a little bit about the space we're in tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Molina. I'm the Director of Operations here at Rosewood. So welcome, everyone. I'm not prepared to say anything. The person who's supposed to talk about this, because he's very involved in all this project, is at the hospital. So, but he's fine. Okay. He texts me, he's fine, but still there. Okay, so I can let you know what we do here. So we are pretty much a nonprofit community center. And what we do is we welcome everyone to use the space. If they want to come just to have a safe place to work, to meet with their friends, to meet with their case management workers or anything, they can just come and use the space, use the Wi-Fi. But on top of that, we have many services like energy assistant. We have a business specialist, a work specialist who can help people to build resume, apply for jobs. We have a resource navigator who can, and I'm a resource navigator myself too. We can sit down with people, talk about a lot of things, and listen to them about the resources and service that they are needing. And we don't like to send people just with a flyer. We pretty much like to help them. So we make phone calls to find shelter for the night, to find the resource and service that they are looking for. So I invite you guys to visit our website and see all the events and all the resources and service that we have here. So thank you and welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, we're going to start with introductions. If I can ask the committee members to start by introducing themselves, and then we'll move on to staff and public.
Michael Eden Hill, he, him.
Rain Feast, Giantino Viatoro, he, him.
Robin Wang, he, him.
Andrea Hamburg, she, her. Faith Graham, she, her. Maria Sippins, she, they.
Sam Barroso, Pcf staff, he, him.
Katie Lister, Pcf staff, she, her.
James Valdez, PCEF staff, he, him pronouns.
Janet Hammer, PCEF staff, she, her pronouns. Laura John, City of Portland.
Michael Kinney, Multnomah Friends Meeting.
Mary Preem, community member, she, her.
Mark McLeod, he, him, and my connection is through the Sierra Club.
Gail Palmer, she, her. I'm with the Centennial Community Association right here in this neighborhood, and with the East Portland Action Plan.
Ingrid Fish, she, her, City of Portland, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
Deidre Sheets, she, her, Nutrition Garden RX.
Jennifer Yoakum, she, her, Northwest Natural.
Shauna Brownstein, she, her, PGE.
Eric Hesse, he, him, Portland Bureau of Transportation.
Emma Sagor, she, her, Natural Resources Defense Council and Portland Bureau of Transportation.
Jose Michalakis, he, him, Verde.
Cora Potter, she, they, TriMet.
Michael Tete, Portland Bureau of Transportation, he, him.
Micah Meskel, Portland Audubon, he, him.
James Donnelly, Elevate Energy.
Ketty Loeb, Craft 3, she, her.
Andrew Planbeck, he, him, Portland Streetcar Inc.
Kari Schlosshauer, she, they, Safe Routes Partnership and Getting There Together Coalition.
Cassandra Griffin, Community Cycling Center, she, her.
Garrett Kransky, he, him, with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality.
Just quick intro. Name, organization.
Bill Henry with a firm called Jewel.
June Reyes with City of Portland, PCEF staff, and usually Open Signal.
And grateful for Open Signal here.
Tony Prado, Open Signal, he, him.
Michael Adegueo, Open Signal Production Service, he, him, his.
And is there anyone on the phone who would like to introduce yourself? All right. Thank you all for indulging us in that. So the first order of business before we move on to public comment is to approve the minutes. Sorry, I just had to count you to confirm that there were enough of you to do that, and there are. So to approve the minutes from the February 18th meeting, were there any comments or edits or changes requested from those minutes? Nope. All right, then we will call them approved. So next, I'd like to invite, I apologize. We usually start our meetings with a kind of opening inspiration, and Maria is our person who is going to provide the opening inspiration and was running a little bit late, so we forgot it. But now is your moment.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us in person and anybody else on the call who didn't get to introduce themselves. I'm delighted to have us here to talk about transportation and lots of pressing issues here in Portland and beyond. Tonight's inspiration comes from People for Mobility Justice, an organization in Los Angeles, and organization that works nationally as well to continue to push agencies and communities to think intentionally about transportation equity, racial justice, and climate action. So I want to call your attention to a couple of things to help frame our lenses tonight around mobility justice. And the organization calls upon people to embrace this vision that people have the freedom and resources to move in public spaces with love and dignity. And with that, I really like to challenge ourselves to think about the literal intersections in our lives, as well as the social, cultural, and political intersections that impact how we make transportation decisions, how we travel, and how we move about in our lives. Mobility, not just how we get to point A to point B, but how we transcend barriers and injustices, are all things we should consider. And with that, I want to pull in some of the principles of mobility justice just quickly and to list them off so we can get into that headspace as we look into transportation. Some of the 5 Ds that are worth recognizing are decolonize, decriminalize, decongest, dignify, and dream. And those are some things I'd like to keep in mind that inform how I operate as a transportation planner. And as I hope we can lead into this work, those are things that we can consider. So thank you for that moment, and we can talk more about this as the evening proceeds.
Thanks, Maria. All right, it looks like we have one person signed up for public comment. I'd like to invite Gail to come up here to the microphone, and want me to hand these out as well?
Hi, good evening. I'd like to thank you for meeting here at Rosewood. It's the most busy and happening place in this part of town. It was easy for me, about 6 blocks from my house, so thank you very much. I can dash home to my out-of-town guests after this. I'm here, as I said, I'm secretary of the Centennial Community Association, which covers the blocks just south and to the east, a little bit to the west of this site. And I'm here tonight on behalf of the East Portland Action Plan. last night at our general monthly meeting, the East Portland Action Plan membership approved through consensus this letter that I'm presenting to you tonight. And there are about 40 or 50 people generally at those meetings, and we invite members of this committee to join us at one of those general meetings, which is always the fourth Wednesday of the month, held at the David Douglas Central School Board offices. So this letter we wanted to present to the Community Benefits Grant Fund Committee. It invites or it offers the assistance of the membership of East Portland Action Plan to help publicize and advocate for the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, and to do our best to invite people to participate and undertake projects that they can propose that will benefit all of East Portland members. It also goes on to talk about the fact that the action plan is a document that was developed 10 years ago by some familiar people that you know in town, Mayor Ted Wheeler, Congressman Jeff Merkley, Commissioner Joanne Hardesty have all been active with the East Portland Action Plan over this last 10 years. So that document is a document that we feel aligns very strongly with the goals of this commission and the purposes and actions that will come from it. So I'm part of the Economic Development Subcommittee of the Action Plan and the Operations Subcommittees, and we have established a priority this beginning for 2021 to monitor and promote projects in East Portland that maximize economic benefits accruing to residents of East Portland from the Portland Clean Energy Fund initiative. And there's some citations in the letter to parts of the plan that align with the goals, and I will be the representative officially to the subcommittee and to the action plan membership and report on your progress. So the primary request in this letter is that you take time to review the action plan as it is in place. It represents the last 10 years of work, and consider giving priority to community development actions that are broadly beneficial to all East Portland residents that are outlined in the action plan. And we would like to, as I said, invite you to come and present at one of the general meetings. So that is my statement tonight, and I look forward to being here at many of the meetings so we can report back progress to our group. Thank you.
Thank you. And is this everything in this folder is for us?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Sam, did you want to say a few words? And then we'll invite Laura John to come up.
Great. Before I turn this over to Laura John, our City of Portland Tribal Liaison Director, I just want to share a little bit and give some context. And some of this context will be, I want to keep it tight so it'll be relevant really to the committee, but we'll dig into that a little bit later too. As you know, we're often balancing a lot of tensions to make our institutions, governments, markets, nonprofit sectors work better for everyone. In doing this, it takes a lot of courage to push against those systems, and I want to acknowledge that certainly I missed an opportunity with the first 5 community members to push and create room for you all to bring an Indigenous perspective on this body. Those tensions we must always balance, and I would say we probably never have the fortitude of having the full picture, but I acknowledge that we're as a team committed to working with you all in this effort. And I don't want to really say much more. I think it's important that I turn this over to Laura John and let you all hear from her directly. So Laura John, thank you for being here with us today.
Is that good? Good evening. My name is Laura John. I'm the Tribal Relations Director. I'm housed in the Office of Government Relations downtown at City Hall. I wanted to start this evening by sharing a little bit about what I do for the city, and then would rather me not talk at the committee. but have an opportunity for some dialogue and a little bit of discussion. So I started at the city 2.5 years ago. I'm the second person to serve in this position. There was one liaison in the mayor's office prior to me coming on staff. She was only on staff for about 3 months under the Hales administration. When Mayor Wheeler came into office, there was a request from our community that they ensure that that position was reinstated. He went through the process to work with community to create my position. They based the creation of my position also on a directive that came from City Council in 2012 that was brought by Commissioner Fritz. That particular directive said that the city would formalize partnerships with tribal governments and create a process for holding that engagement with tribal governments so that the city will ensure that we are upholding treaty rights of tribes in this region, as well as working beyond that to ensure that Native people are able to continue to practice their cultural lifeways, exercise their treaty rights, and ensure that they have a place here in the city. The work that I do primarily is provide technical support and advising to the 26 bureaus of the city, as well as the 6 elected offices. We've been doing this work for about 2.5 years. We are working towards having clear work plans related to tribal work that are annual. So planning and sustainability will potentially have something like that in the future. The work that I do is assist the bureaus in assessing their work to ensure that we are meeting that directive from City Council, as well as helping to coordinate any interactions or engagement that happens between the City of Portland and tribal governments. Another part of the work that I do, aside from internally and then supporting the city's communication, engagement, and partnerships with tribal governments in the region, is also bringing the voice of the Native community here in our city. I'm a Portlander, born and raised. I know community. Community knows me. They know my parents. Some know my grandparents. They know my kids. They know that they can bring things to me if they have issues, if they have concerns. That's been a part of the position that has been so rewarding for me, because it is really the first time that our community has ever had a doorway to the city. To have that way to get assistance if they're not being heard. I wanted to spend some time this evening hearing from the committee in what you all would like to accomplish related to what was mentioned prior to me coming to the mic, which is having that Indigenous lens and that Indigenous inclusion. The reality for our people is that when push comes to shove, when there are multiple pressures coming from different angles, our community almost always is the one that is left out. It's important for everyone to reflect on why that's happening. Why are we so invisible? Why are we extremely marginalized, excluded, and erased? Some will say that that is the system of colonization working. And so many of us in our day-to-day forget. I'm really excited to be at the city to help support changing that mindset. It's a very, very exciting time. So I want to put it back to you. What do you all want to accomplish?
Well, thank you for your testimony and initiating this dialogue. I think it's really, really important. It's definitely been on my mind as we've solidified our committee and understand that there is really no representation. And I think developing a lens, I think, is an important need here in this committee. But I think where I think we need to land is sharing power. And so I think, this is a dialogue, but I would love to find a way where we as a committee, if we have the power to, create an additional seat for having Indigenous representation here, because I think, as you've highlighted in your testimony, we, I don't think we can continue, recreating harm unless we decide to do something different. And I think creating space seems to be an appropriate remedy here.
Michael, and then Maria, and then Paige.
Thank you for coming out. I think that I would just like to make a statement that I think that representation, we all represent communities, groups, families, extended families, that I know who I represent, I know the communities that I represent, and that I kind of sit here and fight for, right? I really worry that because we don't have an Indigenous voice, we don't have that voice every meeting representing, and we may very easily let it slip, right? We may very easily not represent or make that space for Indigenous voices. And I'm not sure how every meeting that we remember that we need that voice. So that's my concern for our committee. And I don't know if you have any suggestions. I don't know.
I think there are multiple ways that the PCEF committee can go about doing that. I don't necessarily want to come and tell you how to do that. I would love to work with the committee to do that, to find those ways. I think short-term and long-term approaches. I also want to reflect that when we're inclusive of Native people, we need to be very mindful that that is a political status. It is not a race or ethnic group in the sense that it's defined in our country. Native people are multicultural. Native people represent their Native community and their culture and their values. Those that are multiracial also represent their African American community, their Asian American community, their white community. And so to keep that in mind, that having a seat for an Indigenous person is really important, and I would really support that happening. But also know that you could have someone on the committee who represents a community of color and who is also Indigenous and Native from North America, that has that unique political status, which is that very specified relationship through tribal government that has sovereignty in the United States.
Maria?
Thank you. I'm here to learn and to find ways to remedy, rectify, and repair the ways that we've been operating that have been excluding Native representation and trying to find solutions with everyone within what we can do with the policy and the timeline that we have to find ways to do all of that work. And it's not too late. I know we always think about this every time another meeting passes or another conversation happens where we haven't filled that void. And I want to do that intentionally and in a way that's not just filling a seat, but keeping in mind all the things, Laura, that you said and ways we can be really mindful of doing this. So I look to the City of Portland staff to, continue reminding us how to stay on task, but also how to do this in a really intentional way. Ranfis talked about sharing power, and that's absolutely what it boils down to. And it's a privilege for us to serve here, and we want to know how to do this well.
Faith, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here and being so thoughtful with your questions as well as what you're offering to us, so thank you. And I second everything that everyone else has said here, and that it's really important that we hold that space. And we also know that while we're here and we have the incredible honor and privilege of being here, we also don't stand alone in people that are concerned about what's happening with PCEF. I'm really curious from your perspective, and I don't know if this dialogue can continue now or at some future time. I hope it can continue now, but you have a huge task on your plate in your work world to be a liaison for all of these agencies. What have you seen that maybe we can use to really inform and make sure, absent a seat or with a seat, that we are really we're sitting in that commitment?
What I've seen happen with other bureaus as this work has unfolded is that typically it starts out where there is a surface level awareness, potentially not seeing fully all of the places that the work that that person does or their bureau or that the city does, how that has intersection with Native issues or treaty rights or working with tribal governments. The progression to get from that place to a place where there's momentum, there's commitment, it's genuine commitment, is about that gradual but consistent learning, not a one-off. That has been really powerful for folks. Attending trainings if they're available, homework, opportunities to go in as a part of a city delegation to visit a tribe in the region. We've had 2 visits so far. I think one pillar that has been a real game changer is the annual Tribal Nation Summit. We had our second summit this last fall. It was an opportunity where city employees spent a day receiving training, kind of a basics training in tribal governance and sovereignty, with opportunity for some in-depth conversation about particular topics, such as using a land acknowledgement, such as how to do good community engagement, communications training. That was an opportunity for people to prepare and get basics down to then on day 2 engage in conversation in summit discussions about particular issue areas. Climate action was one of those issue areas. I think that that is an opportunity that should be considered for PCEF committee members to attend. A number of the staff that you see here, can I see a raise of hand, even open signal if there's anyone that was involved in the summit? So we had a number of BPS staff that participated. I would like to extend that invitation to you all for this year's summit, and we'll make sure to get information about that to the staff.
Robin?
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and being here with us tonight. I think what would be helpful for me, I think, is have a better understanding of, what are some of the climate change related issues that affect the Native American community. And one idea that came to mind is every time we meet here, at least the last few months, we hear about a particular subject area. I think tonight's transportation, and we kind of get all, caught up on some of the issues, related to transportation and PCEF. I think it would be helpful for me, whether here or in a tour or something, is to learn about the issues that face the Native American communities and how PCEF can be used to, address some of those challenges. Because honestly, I don't know. And if I don't know what the challenges are, if we see a proposal, I'm not going to make an informed decision. And obviously, I can't speak for the other committee members, but for me, it would be just very helpful just to understand what are the challenges, and how PCEF could address some of them.
I think that you make a really good point, and that's pretty regular advice that I give to city employees is, let's get you out there to learn from the tribes, to learn from the community. I think that is something that we could explore further, potential to go and visit a tribe and learn about their climate action work. There is an opportunity to, there is a regional climate action gathering that Affiliated Tribes and Northwest Indians, which is a regional congress, hosts each year. We had some BPS staff attend that conference this last year. That is another opportunity where you would hear from multiple tribes on what they're doing, what the challenges are, how tribes are working to do climate action work that supports their existence as Native people, upholds their sovereignty and self-determination, how they are dealing with federal policies, state policies, and local policies. Those issues are going to give you a global view that I think would help you all to have a lens that would be very valuable as grantees are determined. Because any of these projects, if they do the work that they're intending to do, will impact the availability of protected cultural resources for Indigenous people, not only in the region or in this country, but worldwide. I think there's also an opportunity to get out into community, or to potentially have community come here to get a better sense of what does this work look like when it's done here in the city, and how does that impact the Native community? Where would they potentially be left out? Where are the blind spots or the gaps that grantees may be able to help fill? What I hope is that committee members get to a place of understanding that every grantee has an opportunity to have positive impact on Native people. Just the basics of that work connects.
Nice.
Just want to echo what folks have already shared, and also say thank you for coming to talk with us about what this work has meant for you in the space of invisibility. And I'm trying to be thoughtful as we're navigating the space of needing more learning and insight, that I think there's a balance of how we show up in a way that's accountable and still addressing and holding space. And so I think there's a little bit of potential quarterly or reoccurring homework, if you will, for us to take on in unpacking what that looks like potentially later. And also just want to echo some thoughts around an extra or an additional seat. If quorum is a thing, or in terms of votes, maybe there are 2 seats that we seek to meet this goal to do that. So I think I'm highly interested in that. And short and long-term solutions we might be able to explore in a future discussion that is holding that space and leaning on us to be willing to learn, and also hold that balance of the self-agency and accountability, and also what we might lean on for tribal communities in terms of learning and how that process should look. And so yes to the seat, maybe 2, if that's a thing that is a better or more feasible discussion, and thinking about a strategy or maybe our own work plan that we might make as a body would be great.
Faith?
Can I actually say one thing?
Yeah.
So I think that, I've already given staff a homework idea for you. I suggested staff find some relevant chapters from a book by John Mohawk, the late John Mohawk. The title of the book is Thinking in Indian. He's a renowned speaker, and this is a collection of his essays. I think there's also an opportunity for a future conversation about values and principles. When you set side by side indigenous values and principles and Western, or I could say settler colonial values and principles, you can literally put them on a continuum. They are polar opposite in every way possible. I would encourage the consideration of looking at those values and seeing if there is a way that you can center the committee's values and principles through an Indigenous lens. An example value would be time. A settler colonial mindset of time is that it's linear. There's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of punitiveness. And you compare that to an indigenous sense of time, which is circular. And as I was taught by my elders, there is no past, present, or future. It's all one. And things need to have time, and they will unfold as they are intended to, if you trust that process.
I'm wondering if you are willing or able to be an advisor to this committee in a more direct manner than perhaps, or if there's opportunity for you to have a colleague that joins you in the city to also support the work that you do, that maybe could be a direct colleague. You may not be able to answer that right now, but consider whether or not that's something you could do for us. And actually, what you just raised is so important to us right now today with our work that we're going to do this afternoon. So if you have a site that we can go to in a break, that would be great.
I'm presently a program of one. I look forward to having further conversation with staff around the potential to help advise the committee or to support the staff to advise you. And I think there's also opportunity to identify other advisors that are from our community.
Megan?
Hi, and thank you, as everyone has said, for being here and speaking with us. My question's about whether you have I'm just curious about outreach about PCEF to the diverse Native American Indigenous communities here, and if you have a sense of the state of that outreach and whether lots of folks are already very aware of PCEF and are ramping up to apply and are listening in on conversations, or have we been not, or do we have a long way to go in ramping up that outreach? And maybe that's a question for staff too, but curious about that.
So I am aware that I believe most of the Native specific nonprofits are aware of PCEF. It's not, to my understanding, it is not in the awareness of the majority of our community. I had provided an opportunity for community to, what was it that we did over at, to attend a, no, it was a PCEF meeting that was prior to the committee being, yes, and none of them. And this is a large, active, environmentally focused group of folks from our community. Hardly anyone knew what PCEF was.
Any other comments or questions before we move on to the next agenda item? Grand Peace?
I think maybe the committee, in the spirit of keeping the, thank you, committee accountable, maybe if we can have this as an agenda item for the next meeting and see if we can think through some short-term and long-term action items, and would love to reach out to you and see how we can sort of think about that in between now and our next meeting. But thank you for coming and testifying.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to come speak with you this evening. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Laura.
All right. Before we go on, thank you, Laura John. Before we go on to our, turn the conversation into the transportation piece of the conversation this evening, and I turn it over to Ingrid Fish from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, as well as Emma Sagar from the Portland Bureau of Transportation. I want to just provide a little context that I think is going to be important to know for this conversation this evening. As you've heard in one of the early presentations given to the meeting, greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector are the largest sector of emissions and the only sector where our emissions are going up. And so I think it's in that context, and I don't want to take anything away from what Emma and Ingrid will say, but what I want to at least call out is you notice that within the Portland Clean Energy Fund, the funding sectors, none of them explicitly call out transportation. And I think wanting to bring that into the space here and just talk about that, I think in having conversations with some of the initiative petitioners, I think we discussed what this was and why for that, given a sector that's as significant as it is, why it may not have been called out as a specific funding allocation. Some of the reasons, and these are not necessarily perfect, complete, but it's part of the conversation that I think it's important you all to hold, is that transportation investments are incredibly expensive. this pool of funds, while 44 to 61 million is incredibly large, there was a sense that they could be eaten up like that with some transportation investment. So just generally, there was a certain sense around that. There was also a sense that in the same way you look at maybe energy efficiency, renewable energy investments, even green infrastructure and sustainable ag investments, those investments can be targeted in place at a specific population. You can target the beneficiaries of those resources. While transportation is an incredible cost to low-income households, communities of color broadly, as well as those that are not able, those are disabled, those investments are often system-wide investments, and there's a challenge with struggling with how to see those system-wide investments and how you could be targeted towards those that we talk about in the goals in this initiative, in this fund. And then lastly, I think there was a sense of uncertainty about the potential for jobs as you think about the other categories. And I think it's an area for robust discussion, but certainly as you think about the other categories, there was at least a sense that those would materialize in new jobs, in green jobs for communities of color and low-income folks. So I don't need to say too much more, but I think that's just some of the context that you need to hold as you think about the conversation today, and I think it's important to share. And lastly, it's important to know, but some of the funds generated, and it depends on how detailed you look at the initiative language, but some of the funds generated from the clean energy surcharge are generated off of fossil fuel suppliers. These are our gas stations, probably corporate-owned gas stations, and those specific funds are restricted, and they're restricted by the Highway Trust Fund. It's a thing we can get into, but the Highway Trust Fund, the general gist of it is that it's investments that have to fall within the road right-of-way. Those particular dollars within PCEF, as our revenue division hold those numbers, but the general sense that as we try to figure out how much those dollars would be is they said that those were insignificant. Insignificant in the grand scheme of 44 to 61 million, but that doesn't mean insignificant altogether. Within the initiative as well, those funds were specifically called out to be managed by PBOT. So I want to acknowledge those funds exist. They are managed by PBOT, and we are currently in conversation to tease out how we can work together in bringing those decisions and bringing your input to that particular pool of resources. But those were a set-aside pool of resources that were called out in the initiative to be managed by PBOT. And again, while insignificant in the broad pool of the resource, in the broad context of 44 to 61 million, we'll get a better handle on those numbers soon. I don't need to say any more else with that.
All right. Thanks, Sam. So we are, you may have noticed, running a little bit behind on the agenda. We talked with Laura John earlier today, and she let us know she had a little bit more time to spend with us, so we have adjusted the schedule. Try and make up as much time as possible, but also want to honor all the other folks who have prepared to be here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid and Emma to introduce themselves and talk to you about transportation, and you push down to advance.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having Ingrid and I here. We're really grateful for the opportunity and appreciative to spend some time talking about transportation. My name's Emma Sagor. As you heard from my introduction, I wear a couple different hats. I'm technically an employee of the Natural Resources Defense Council, but I'm embedded full-time with the City of Portland and specifically the Bureau of Transportation through the American Cities Climate Challenge, which is a 2-year initiative engaging 25 of America's largest cities in accelerating and augmenting our climate impact. And so very excited to be here speaking with you tonight. And Ingrid, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, I'm Ingrid Fish. I work for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. The work that I do is kind of looking at the future of the transportation system through both an equity and climate lens. So I work very closely with the Transportation Bureau, but I'm based in planning and sustainability.
Great. And so the purpose of our presentation tonight, and we will try to keep it as tight as possible so that we leave time for the community panel as well, but we wanted to provide a brief overview of the role that we see from the city perspective that transportation plays in climate justice. So this isn't just going to be a download on transportation and what we do with transportation at the city, but really how we see the intersection of transportation, climate, and equity in our work. And I think this is more and more being reflected in the policy documents of both of our bureaus. So speaking from the Bureau of Transportation perspective, we just adopted a new strategic plan that has an overarching goal of transportation justice, which says that when we make any decisions, we ask ourselves two questions. Will it advance racial equity, and will it reduce carbon emissions? And BPS also has stated policy on the books that's very similar. So we really want to provide that perspective and really welcome any questions you have about how we're doing that. And we also are working closely together, both of our bureaus, in this work, but also really closely with community. And one thing I'll say is that we are learning every day from that engagement with community. And it's really a journey, that journey to understand what transportation justice looks like. So we're excited to share what we have so far, but we're also growing and learning all the time. And so what we're going to cover tonight is a little bit of context about transportation's role in the climate crisis and why it's such an important part of this conversation. We'll talk a little bit about the status quo of transportation today and some of the current inequities in our system. And then we'll talk a little bit about the city's strategy for reducing transportation emissions while taking that transportation justice lens. And finally, we're going to connect it all together by kind of looking at the opportunities that we see around transportation in this just climate transition and try to align that with some of the PCEF priorities and share some thoughts and ideas that we've received from community around that.
Great, I'll take the next slide. So I think that you have already heard from my colleague Kyle Diesener, who spoke about kind of general carbon emission data. Like Emma said, we're going to be focusing more on transportation-related data. So just a little kind of quick grounding. Sam mentioned too, as you can see here, the biggest source of local greenhouse gas emissions is from the transportation sector. And local emissions have increased significantly since 2013 and accounts for, back in 2013, it only accounted for 38%. Now we're at 42%. Most of this comes from light-duty vehicles powered by gas, and they're the biggest contributor, and it's about 55%. So next slide. So this is the good news slide. Overall, our carbon emissions are trending down. So if you look at all of the carbon emissions together, trending down. And in comparison to the rest of the country, our local carbon emissions we're doing much better and going down. But if you look at this slide, you can see that we started some kind of plateauing in our progress since 2012. So we're headed in the wrong direction in the transportation sector. We have basically, emissions have increased over the past 5 years. We're currently at about 8% over our 1990 levels and 14% over their lowest, when we were at the lowest level, which was 2012. Our per person vehicle miles traveled is actually remained pretty stable. Even though fuel efficiency standards have increased and our vehicles have improved. So what's causing the rise in transportation? Mostly the biggest factor is an increased number of vehicle trips as the population grows. So more people are coming to Portland and moving around our city. In addition to that, a low cost of fuel, increased construction, and other economic activity. These are all kind of factors that cause our emissions from the transportation sector.
And so that's kind of the climate look at transportation, kind of taking the equity lens. Our current system, the status quo, is quite inequitable. We experience lots of things and symptoms of our transportation system, things like congestion, things like climate impacts, and those fall disproportionately on our most vulnerable communities, our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, as well as our low-income communities. So this is just a few statistics that kind of show that we see greater transportation burdens and less access to options. So you'll see on the slide that almost 31% of Black households don't have access to a vehicle, while just under 14% of white households do not have access to a vehicle. And that then also correlates with higher rates of transit ridership among our communities of color. And what you can see from this graph up here too is that then the commute times for communities of color are longer than white commuters. And recent research is showing that commute time is one of the biggest correlations with poverty in our society. And so this really becomes an equity issue. And I will say that these problems are exacerbated as displacement gets worse. So as gentrification and rising affordability costs push people further out, these options become fewer and fewer, which just exacerbates these inequities in our system. The way that our transportation system is funded is also inequitable and currently regressive. Transportation is a really high household cost. It's often the second highest household cost behind housing. And the current way that we fund that system through gas taxes and vehicle registration fees are flat, and so they have a disproportionate impact on those of us who have lower incomes. And then finally, and kind of bringing this back from the climate perspective, the climate impacts and climate and safety impacts that we see from our transportation system fall most heavily on our most vulnerable communities. So things like air pollution, which Ingrid's going to talk about in a second. But then, as you'll kind of see up there, that's a graph that's from our Vision Zero team that shows as displacement pushes our most vulnerable communities further and further out, they're in areas with less safety infrastructure, less improved transportation infrastructure. And the other thing to touch on this slide is that the history of how our transportation system has been developed has also been on the backs of communities of color. So that's a picture of the construction of I-5 through the historically Black Albina neighborhood. So there's a legacy here of inequities and of disruption.
So pictured here is a map of nitrogen dioxide, or NO2 concentration across Portland. And transportation is a major source of NO2. NO2 is harmful to health and can cause inflammation in the lungs, chest pain, coughing, reduce immunity to lung infections. It can also lead to exacerbated chronic respiratory and cardiovascular impacts. NO2 exposure concentrations are highest near freeways and major roadway corridors, where vulnerable communities are more likely to live, work, and play. So think about schools, daycares, churches, services that low-income people and people of color frequent. Breathing in this air pollution also occurs while traveling through these polluted transportation corridors. Being on a bus or in a car doesn't protect us from exposure to pollution. So communities that are displaced due to rising housing costs and more have longer commute times between places to live and places to work, and they also have an increased exposure to air pollution. So this uneven pollution landscape means low-income people and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to transportation-related pollution. Travel time and commute times relate to health, prosperity, and quality of life. People who spend less time commuting are exposed to less air pollution and are able to spend more time productively, such as for earning money and spending time with family. Next slide. So we're facing the music, and we know that we cannot wait to tackle the climate crisis. Our goals must be ambitious. We must reduce more emissions and do so quickly. The City of Portland has now committed to net zero. We've signed on to the Paris Climate Accord agreement, so we need to get to net zero by 2050. Our strategy is a three-pronged strategy. The first is really creating more affordable, walkable, connected, and complete neighborhoods, so that people don't need to travel as far, and our energy needs are reduced because of that, and a lot of this can be achieved through land use strategies. Our second strategy is really drastically reducing the number of motor vehicle trips. We need to cut it in half by 2030. And creating policies and making investments that support walking, biking, and taking public transit before single occupancy vehicle use. So you see this triangle up here, which is our people movement hierarchy, and it's a guide for us to make investments in policy decisions. And the third prong is really needing to focus on the cars that remain on the road and fuel switching for those cars. So switching to lower carbon fuels for those vehicles, like electricity, renewable natural gas, renewable biodiesel. Next slide. So most cities are not on track to meet their climate goals. We've completed many of the low-hanging fruit actions, And we're really noticing that we need to move to more difficult things and start kind of doing things differently. Due to generations of institutional racism, our investments in transportation and climate-friendly projects have benefited high-income Portlanders. This is ironic because low-income communities and people of color tend to be the most highly impacted by climate change. So city staff are, like I said before, are working to encourage people to walk, bike, and take public transit. These things are much easier to do when you live inside the inner neighborhoods that are closer to the central city. The further out you get, the harder it is to have access to frequent transit, the harder it is to be able to safely bike, the harder it is to walk places. So EVs, especially used EVs, electric vehicles, are an inexpensive and relatively clean, equitable mobility tool for those who live and have often been displaced to areas of the city where it's difficult to walk, bike, and take public transit. It's the same side, yeah. The idea that EVs are only for the rich is no longer true. Why should people with means be the only people who benefit from virtually no maintenance costs and very low fuel costs? Currently, we have used EVs that are available for between $10,000 and $5,000. And coupling that with our state rebates, which are $2,500 that are earmarked for low and moderate income people, you can get a really great used EV for $2,500. These vehicles become, so just want to make the point that in order for us to really realize significant carbon emission reductions and air quality improvements, the EV market needs to be accessible to everyone. We're additionally very interested in trying to figure out how we can boost kind of wealth building types of projects for low-income people and people of color through electric vehicles. So I want you to be kind of mindful of that as you're seeing applications. So the next slide has to do with an analysis that we did at the City of Portland, which really looked at where ideal places in the City of Portland would be to locate charging infrastructure. And we kind of layered it based on several different factors. We looked at areas that where people live that were driving longer distances to commute. We were looking at areas that had higher proportions of multifamily housing. We were looking at areas where there were few existing charging stations to begin with, so gap areas. We were looking at areas where there were limited access to frequent transit and bike routes, and in areas that enable low-income populations to gain access to EVs. So we kind of layered all these factors and have been sharing this analysis with anyone who's interested in putting in charging infrastructure in Portland. The utilities have been probably making the biggest amounts of investments recently, and we have shared this information with them, which is the reason why we see an electric avenue out at Holgate and 82nd. Most of the other kind of electric vehicle hubs have been focused towards the inner city. So we're really trying to kind of make sure that there's EV infrastructure in areas where low-income people and people of color can actually access.
And so Portland's EV strategy is kind of one example of where we are facing the music, looking at the stark climate and equity realities of our current transportation system, and seeking those opportunities to turn those challenges into something where we can improve climate and equity outcomes. And I just kind of wanted to take a minute to summarize sort of how we see a just transportation transition occurring. So I think the main message here is that we feel we can tackle some of the transportation challenges that we face today in ways that create opportunities for a more just and equitable transportation future. So some examples, we currently have few people of color in the transportation workforce. Well, we could, through this transition, create career opportunities for more people of color. We will talk a lot about ways that, steps we can take to reduce the carbon emissions and instead expand access to alternative fuels and low carbon options. We can go from a public health crisis to public health solutions, look at what has been traditionally the neighborhood disruption from the transportation space to placemaking opportunities. And through all of this, we think that we can go from opportunity, or from a reality where today transportation is incredibly expensive, to ways where we can provide more and more affordable mobility options for folks. And so to conclude our presentation, we kind of wanted to take a step back and look at the PCEF priorities, the 4 kind of buckets, and start to kind of align some of those opportunities I summarized on the last slide with these opportunity areas. And we're going to walk through each of the 4 and just provide some examples of both existing projects that are community-led that connect transportation with these values enshrined in the PCEF program, but also just some ideas that have come up in our conversations with community that we just kind of want to give to illustrate how I think some of this nexus could be spelled out. And we'll start with Ingrid kind of speaking a little bit more about that electrification space and the clean energy nexus.
So just kind of focusing on the clean energy programs bucket. Just to name a program that has happened in the past that might have been a good candidate for PCEF funds. The Community Electric Bike Program is an example of a program, and it consisted of a partnership between the Community Cycling Center, Gen Z, which is an electric bike company, Andando and Bicicletas in Coley, 4th and the 11th Hour Project. And it happened January through November of 2017. And the objective was to test how electric bikes could benefit people in underserved communities and how they can help diversify and improve options for unlicensed individuals. There were 3 cohorts of 10 participants, and they were given the use of an e-bike along with training, orientation, and safety equipment for 10 weeks. Participants took surveys throughout the process. My understanding is that it was a successful program and that it resulted in a portion of participants purchasing e-bikes and actually using them as a cheap transportation option for getting around.
And so some other ideas that are kind of related to that have come up in our conversations with community might be more things around e-bikes, maybe things that make it easier to bulk buy them for residents of affordable housing complexes or for low-income employees, different jobs opportunities around EV tech maintenance and infrastructure, and also this idea of micro-mobility hubs, kind of centers where you've got lots of different options that are cleanly powered through clean energy. So then the second category in workforce development, we see the clean energy transition as creating immense opportunity for new, innovative, and sustainable jobs in the transportation space. And jobs in transportation can mean so many different things. It can mean, traditional labor, construction, maintenance, and operations jobs, and the actual rolling out of clean and alternative transportation infrastructure, bike lanes, bus lanes, these kinds of things. But it can also be in the technology and innovation space, which is just evolving rapidly in the transportation sector. They can be planning and engineering jobs, policy development, and then there's a real wealth of jobs around outreach and community engagement in the transportation space. And so one example we just wanted to highlight of an existing community-led initiative was the Northeast 72nd Avenue Green Street project led by Verde. It's Verde Builds organization or social enterprise, which Verde partnered with various contractors to do a lot of improvements on this very poorly improved street in Coley that dead-ended at a community garden but couldn't provide access to that park because it lacked sidewalks and other necessary infrastructure. And so through this project, they were able to do a lot of great workforce development and training and really it was the first street and construction project to use non-standard design standards that were presented in the city's Coley Corridor Commercial and Local Streets Plan. So that was kind of narrower driving surfaces, flush curbs, pervious pavement, this kind of thing. So it became a demonstration project, really, and was just a wonderful example of community partnership to solve a problem that then has big climate and transportation benefits. And we see, you know, the opportunities really as endless in the nexus of workforce development and transportation. And what we've heard a desire from our community partners is just more of those programs that are pathways to careers in these spaces, whether that be like pre-apprenticeship programs in the kind of more traditional labor sense, or other kinds of training programs that expose people from communities of color and low-income communities to these job opportunities and provide really good career opportunities. And then on the kind of less training side, we know there's just endless opportunities for business creation and entrepreneurship to fill some gaps. We had a car share program that went away a few months ago. So right now we have no car share provider, for example, in Portland, and that was meeting the needs for a lot of folks, and particularly folks who potentially have been displaced but don't have access to their own car. So there's these opportunities around that, around microtransit, sustainable freight and food delivery is a big one. We know that that's creating a lot of emissions, the new Uber Eats world we live in. There's just a lot of, I think, opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship.
One example I wanted to mention that it has happened in Huron, California. There's an organization called Green Ratitos, and it's a Latino-owned EV car share there was a transportation gap. It's a rural area, and they were able to form their own business, and they formed an EV car share, Latino-owned, supported by EVgo. And it's been really successful and has provided jobs for people. So that's just another example. Thanks.
And then on the green infrastructure side, you know, we definitely see a nexus between sustainable agriculture, stormwater, landscaping, and transportation. Greenery and trees alongside transportation infrastructure is crucial for better health, for carbon sequestration, and it helps make the transportation infrastructure more inviting and attractive, which makes people more likely to use it. So pictured here is an example of a project from Verde Landscape around the Tillicum Bridge for stormwater and landscaping. And so we just think that and we've heard from community, there's a lot of opportunity around tying transportation infrastructure and green infrastructure together, kind of ideas about green up the greenways. We have this network of greenways in our city that aren't really all that green. And I would say that the city, when we do transportation projects, often don't have the ability to put in green infrastructure because of the kind of ongoing maintenance needs and costs around that, but it's not because we don't see the value in it. We absolutely see the value in it, and there are groups like Verde Landscape that I think are creating, there's so much overlap here too between this and workforce development, sequestration, and a variety of the other values and goals of PCEF. And then the last space, innovation, you could truly talk probably about anything for hours here, but we just see a lot of opportunities for innovative thinking. And I started the presentation saying about how much we're learning from community. There's ideas that we couldn't even dream up over at PBOT that our community can. One example of kind of an innovative project that I think touches on our climate action plan goals and the overall goals of PCEF, but probably falls in an innovation category, is the Transportation Wallet program that we have been piloting at PBOT in partnership with 7 community organizations that you can see up there on the screen. So this was a pilot run last summer where we provided 500 free transportation wallets to residents of affordable housing complexes. And what that means is you get a card of credit. It was $308, and that number was picked because that's the annual TriMet low-income pass value. But at these transportation fairs that would be run co-led by PBOT staff and affordable housing complex staff, residents would have the opportunity to sign up for basically what they needed to meet their mobility needs. So they could just go right over to TriMet and buy that transit pass. They could also use it for some bike town credit, for e-scooters, for Lyft and Uber, TNCs, for Car2Go before there was no Car2Go. It really was kind of an option. It opened up a lot of options. And this was just a really wonderful, rich partnership between a government agency and these nonprofits. And then with other partners there as well, the private sector companies that provide some of those options, our transit agency. And this model, we've just seen a lot of interest in maybe potential spin-offs of it and more community-owned versions of this same idea. Maybe things around kind of small businesses, a small business wallet. So really the opportunities are endless. And so we've got a couple other suggestions up there that don't really fall into the other categories. One we wanted to talk about was the linking of these energy retrofits that are happening to buildings or that may be proposed to happen to buildings, and while doing that, also doing things to make those buildings EV ready or EV compatible, so that there's kind of a transportation and building energy co-benefit. Lots of interest in our world in youth-focused programs. We have strong partnerships with the SUN Community Schools, which is Schools Uniting Neighborhoods, and they bring together a variety of service providers to meet the needs of families. We know that there is interest from SUN in transportation services they can provide. And then just more broadly, we know that to avoid some of those inequities and repair past harms, we need to do a much better job in the transportation space of deep, thorough community engagement. And there's just a real wealth of opportunity there and involving more community partners in that work. Ingrid, anything else you want to say on innovation?
I just wanted to mention a couple of community needs assessments that are mobility focused that I think are kind of relevant to this conversation. One is a research done by Opal and PSU, and it relates to, they looked at low-income communities of color and asked them a bunch of mobility-related questions and did focus groups and surveys. And what they found was that most people had smartphones, but the two main reasons or two main functions that people use their smartphones for were texting and photos, and that they weren't necessarily using apps for a variety of reasons. Translation issues with the apps was one. Another was just not knowing how to use the apps. And when we're thinking about new mobility technology and how people connect with these technologies, it is relevant that there's a gap in some of this, these communities with the technology. So some of the findings that came out of that study were really that, in addition, a lot of people had older phones that either ran out of batteries fast or that they didn't have robust data plans, and so they were really reliant on Wi-Fi and really reliant on kind of plugging it in a lot. And so when you're trying to get from one place to another with a mobile app, that makes it very difficult. So just thinking about innovative ways to solve some of these issues that have come up. Another study or another project that has been happening is the Living Coley Mobility Clean Mobility Project in Living Coley. And they did another mobility needs assessment from their population of folks at Hacienda CDC. And it kind of daylighted the issue of privacy with some of these apps as well, as just really kind of feeling vulnerable in terms of giving information over or worrying about their status as like immigration status and what have you. So I know people are doing some active thinking in the community about how to address some of these issues, and that PCEF could be a funding source for some of those solutions.
That's really the conclusion of our presentation. We are welcome to answer any questions you have about what we presented, and also kind of what role PBOT and BPS could play in supporting community-led transportation solutions through PCEF. And once again, thanks so much for your time.
And I'm actually going to ask you to hold your questions. So even though, despite what the slide says, just so that we can give the other folks on the panel an opportunity to tell you a little bit about their organizations, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session, and I'll ask Emma and Ingrid to be available for that time too. Thank you. All right, if I can have the folks on the panel come on up to the table now. Garrett Krensky with the Department of Environmental Quality, Cassandra Griffin with Community Cycling Center, and Huey Ong with the Opal Environmental Justice. Did you have you didn't have one? Okay. Okay, well, we're gonna start with Community Cycling Center, just because this is the order that I put the PDFs together.
Great.
And then move to Derek, and then we will end with Huey. All right?
Can we move that so I can see it, or should I open mine so I can see it? Because I didn't bring a paper copy. Okay, that's a great tip, and let's see if that works.
Yeah. Okay,
That's hilarious.
Push down to advance. That's true.
Push down to advance. Okay.
Is that work?
Hi. We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see. Yeah, but I spent some time with it. Hi, Cassandra Community Cycling Center. Thank you guys. Thank you all for your service, and thank you for having me. And I want to say two things. Thing number one is that this is my second to last day on the job. My wife is due to have a baby at any moment. Forgive me for having my cell phone here. But I really wanted to take the opportunity to come talk to you. So I have a colleague taking over for me. It is Johnny Ling. He will be the next executive director of the Community Cycling Center. He's great. I'm also honored to have the last executive director of the Cycling Center here in the audience, Michael Tete, now at PBOT. Spent about 3 years in this role before my 3 years in it. So he remains a resource to you to talk about this organization and what it brings to the community. So the Community Cycling Center is a 25-year-old transportation justice organization that works to broaden access to bicycling and its benefits. We talk about seeing bicycles as a vehicle for social change and a tool for justice.
What's your vision?
Yeah, vision, you guys can read that. I'm going to try, I have a lot of words that I want to get through, so there was a version of this in your materials. I had some errors in it. This is an updated version that will be shared out, but I can't read everything up there, so it's great if I just literally can't. The organization is 25 years old. Our budget is about $2 million a year. About 1 million of that is the bike shop, and 1 million is everything else. We have a staff headcount of about 33 in the summer, plus 15 more teaching summer camps. We have a board of about 11 people, so just, size and scope. I turn a little bit. That's good. So a lot of folks, like Megan, have been customers in our bike shop. We're at 1700 Northeast Alberta. We've been on Alberta for 25 years. In some ways, it's just any old bike shop, and in some ways, it's the destination bike shop for affordable bikes and a welcoming bike shop in town. We get donated bikes. We sell over 1,000 affordable used bikes per year. We also have a 20% discount on everything for low-income commuters who get government benefits for healthcare or food. And we do free repairs. Shh, don't tell anyone, but when people are bicycle dependent and they walk in the shop and they can't pay, we take care of them because that's what we want to be doing. We also have a vibrant summer camp program, and that is mostly parents who can pay for kids to come to summer camp, but we work with a bunch of government partners, including City of Portland, to afford to offer scholarships. We try to do at least 10% in scholarships per year. That varies per year. Some of that is kids in the mixed income camps, and some of it is what we call community camps, which is all scholarship groups through social service partners, often operating out of that location. So in their neighborhood with their friends, other kids that they know. And we're getting 700 kids per year, learning how to ride safely on city streets. So in terms of teaching generations of cyclists, that's a really big deal. Holiday Bike Drive is one of our best known programs. We give away hundreds of bikes every year to kids from families who can't afford them. In December of this past year, we did 417. This year and going forward, we're moving to a model of doing more smaller giveaway events through community partner organizations. So we're working with ERCO to do one next month. In 2010, my predecessors and Michael's predecessors had the good idea to be more responsive to the community, and so they worked with a couple housing providers to reach out and say, how can we be responsive to your needs? We have bikes, we know about bikes, how can this help you? So the folks in the New Columbia neighborhood of North Portland, which is Oregon's largest affordable housing community, What we heard there is that folks didn't have access to affordable, welcoming, convenient bicycle repairs. So we built them an affordable, convenient bicycle repair facility in the community, and we have been offering free bike repair 2 days a week, 5 months of the year, ever since. In the Northeast Cully neighborhood, we worked with Hacienda, and what we heard there is that Verde has a great leadership development program, and people wanted to continue using their leadership skills that they had, trained through Verde. And so we have a program called Andando en Bicicleta, now y Caminando, because they didn't want to be in Cully anymore, because they want to have a citywide mission of making bicycling more accessible and welcoming to Latinx community members. They have a presence at Sunday Parkways. They do organized rides and events. They have also testified at City Hall recently and Metro previously to try and pass transportation funding and transportation policy things through and say this matters to our community too. Oh no, formatting. So a couple of things that we do that seem particularly relevant to PCEF that I wanted to talk through. I think there's 4 on this PCEF list. The first one got mentioned a little bit. Safe Routes to School is a national concept that is basically working with kids and families to get more active transportation to school for a lot of reasons. One is that it's better for the kids, it improves attendance, it improves outcomes, it improves their health, obviously. But academic outcomes are improved by getting active transportation to school, getting some of their energy out on the way. It is also a great inflection point to get parents open to behavior change. You have a way that you get to work. You don't really want anyone up in your business telling you what to do. But if you're thinking about how you're going to get your kids to school and make the whole day work, and things are different than they used to be, like it's a time when parents are open to behavior change. So it's a great opportunity to talk to them about more walking and more biking. And if you can frame it in terms of it's going to be better for your kids, they're more open to that than if they think you're telling them what to do. We have programs that we are doing in 2 North Portland schools that are close to and connected to our work at the Hub in New Columbia. One of them, I shared a video, I think, of one of our staff members, Natty, who lives in New Columbia, works with us at Rosa Parks School. Our other staff member up there is working at Cesar Chavez Elementary School. He doesn't live in the community, and he's white, but he speaks fluent Spanish, and he has worked with the community to elevate the voices of the Spanish-speaking parents, to get the administration to listen to their ideas about making the school safer for walking and bicycling for their kids. So we closed entrance to a parking lot that was creating a transportation safety hazard. They started a walking school bus program where kids get together and walk to school together with one parent, but not all the parents. We have an after-school bike club. We have, and then the parking lot painting project was a community engagement project. The kids chose the art and decided what they wanted to say and do. PCEF opportunity number 2, we have a workforce development program in alternative high schools right now where we're teaching bicycle mechanics as STEM education in alternative schools. We're not getting kids from point A to we're a bike mechanic at the end of it, but we're getting kids from I'm not showing up to school to I go to bike class because I'm going to earn a bike to keep and I'm really motivated to come to this class. And I've learned that I'm excited to work with my hands, and there's things that I can do that with these skills. There's opportunities for them to come do internships and apprenticeships in our bike shop through that. We're excited to continue that program, to expand that program. We're also interested in other workforce development type programs that build on what we do there. Opportunity number 3, we had a program for years called Create a Commuter, where we were giving bicycles, lights, locks, helmets, and bags to people in workforce development training programs to let them use bicycles as a way to get around. It is often the best way to get around, especially if you have a long, awkward commute at bad transit times. So bicycles can help people get where they need to go in a way that is actually better than the bus can offer. We also had a program in the past few years working with the new bike share system and PBOT and other partners to create a low-income access program for the bike share and to teach people about it, like, hey, you know, it only costs $3 a month and this is how to use it. And we would love to do more of some version of getting more people riding. It's a like high touch human engagement, but teaching people, either giving people bikes or just teaching them how to use the expanded bike share system, which is supposed to be going citywide and which is supposed to be going all electric. So there will be fewer barriers to entry, but there needs to be a outreach to get people to know about it. Some information about the Create a Commuter program that we have had. There's more of that. And finally, I wanted to say we have been talking for years, and we're finally on the cusp of wanting to open another location in East Portland in order to serve the community that is already out here and the community that used to be near our shop that has been displaced to being out here. Rosewood actually has a small bike shop in partnership with another nonprofit organization called PAIR right back here, but aside from that, there's not a lot of bike services and programs in this neighborhood in East Portland broadly, and we would like to offer more of that, and so that is an opportunity for PCEF to work with us to figure out who, what, when, where, and what is it. Like, are we charging market rate, or are we able to offer low-cost services to get people onto bikes, get bikes out of garages and moving again? Okay, I'm almost done. I had 4 comments, concerns, questions that I wanted to raise. The first is that my organization is financially so tight. Part of why I'm leaving is because we have another baby coming, and part of it is because it's like really anxiety inducing to like lie awake in the middle of the night worrying about payroll. And so as you as the committee think about how you're going to be making grants to organizations, I want to remind you that grant writing is a lot of work, and that shiny new objects are not necessarily always better than existing great programs. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2, I'm thrilled to have you talking about transportation in general, and I have been worried that you might end up on a e-bikes are clean energy, but old-fashioned bikes don't quite fit. And I just want to say, like, bikes powered by garbanzo beans are even cleaner than bikes powered by hydroelectricity. So I wanted to say that human contact is slow but really effective at behavior change. And so as you think about what you're going to fund and how you're going to fund it, you know, make sure that hopefully for this, but just in general, like, put enough money into the staff that will actually go out and talk to people and say, like, oh, you haven't ridden a bike in 20 years. Like, want to ride around the block with me? Like, I'm available for that for you, because that is what makes behavior change happen. And finally, I'm sure you guys know that. I imagine it has come up in other conversations, but I wanted to flag that the wage requirement feels really complicated to me, and I don't know how this organization will handle it, and I don't know how other organizations will handle it, and I don't know if you have any flexibility to do anything about it, but I wanted to raise it. Out of the 30-some people in my organization right now, there are 4 who currently make 180% of minimum wage or more. And if we have a program funded by PCEF that is required to pay 180% of minimum wage, that person or people will be making $5 an hour more than their same skilled counterparts. And I would love to change that organization-wide, but like I said, we, you know, are barely hanging on, and that is a concern for me, and I offer that as information.
Thank you, Cassandra. If you would just stay here, and Garrick, if you could move through.
Yeah.
And here, so push down to advance, and Sam, you have the job now of just, you know, awkwardly pushing the time on your phone when Garrick gets near 10 minutes.
Am I going
Right.
backwards or am I going forwards? I can't tell.
Now you're going the
Pressing
right
down.
way.
That's
Okay,
you.
there it is. Great. My name is Garrick Kransky. I'm here with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Pretty honored to be sitting here with some colleagues that I've been working with over the last 10 years as a transportation advocate. So a lot of familiar faces in the room, a lot of good work happening here. But I'm here today because diesel pollution is bad for our health. And exposure to diesel engine exhaust causes cancer, and it increases the risk of heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular disease, It exacerbates asthma and can lead to low birth weights and preterm births. There are no areas of Multnomah County with safe levels of diesel pollution, and hotspots include neighborhoods with higher proportions of people of color. It's going to take a lot of work to address the issue, and I'm here to share some of the information about what Oregon DEQ is doing to reduce diesel emissions. I have to give credit to the good work of folks at Multnomah County because they've provided me with some of the information that I'm going to share here, including some of the photos and slides. So my goal is to give you that overview of the concerns associated with diesel pollution, the community-wide impacts in Oregon, how DEQ is working to reduce the emissions, and how we might assemble diesel emission reduction projects that help advance environmental justice and improve air quality by combining existing sources of grant funding in creative projects. The majority of a diesel engine's pollutants are ultrafine particulates, known as PM 2.5, with a diameter of 2.5 microns or less in width. These very small particles have a large surface area compared with their mass, which allows toxic and carcinogenic properties to hold onto their surface. And because of their size, the particulates are easily inhaled. They can remain in lower areas of the lungs. They're also capable of entering the bloodstream, allowing them to be circulated to all parts of the body. So in Oregon, and some of this was discussed during Ingrid and Emma's conversations, the majority of our emissions come from non-road diesel equipment, such as backhoes, cranes, concrete mixing trucks, construction and logging equipment, and other heavy machinery. A significant amount also comes from medium and heavy-duty trucks and other diesel vehicles. So for us at DEQ, reducing PM 2.5 not only improves air quality, but also improves the health of our community. Air pollution in Multnomah County comes from a similar mixture of daily activities. While industry is responsible for a piece of the pie, the greatest sources of health risk from air pollution come from cars and trucks and what are known as secondary pollutants. Secondary pollutants are the chemicals that are transformed in the atmosphere into another chemical that are not directly emitted by a specific source. So for example, smog or ozone is a secondary pollutant, and it's responsible for about 33% of Multnomah County's cancer risk from air pollution. On-road mobile sources, cars and trucks, account for about 19% of that cancer risk. And obviously the cars and trucks and the ozone that is formed from them is sort of a related set of pollutants that we face. And one important thing to note on this slide is that these emissions don't fully take into account diesel particulate matter. So it's higher in Multnomah County than any other county in the state, and it's part of the reason we're so concerned and focused about reducing the emissions. Again, I want to give credit to Multnomah County for the information presented here. There are 171 census tracts in Multnomah County. The 17 tracts with the highest estimated cancer risk from air toxics, the top 10%, are highlighted here. About 78,000 people live in these tracts, which span a broad range of demographic and socioeconomic conditions. These tracts include some of the wealthiest in the county and some of the poorest. They also include some of the most racially diverse as well as some of the most homogeneous. The picture of diesel pollution in our community and on our health is not good. There is, however, a long history of federal regulations for both on-road and non-road diesel engines, and these standards apply to the manufacture of new engines. So I'll walk through this pretty quickly. Essentially, this figure shows the history of diesel emission standards for heavy-duty diesel trucks. In this context, heavy-duty means greater than 14,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight. So we're talking about your Class 8 long-haul trucks, box delivery trucks, and school buses. We're not talking about a personal vehicle like a Ford F-350. The figure shows diesel particulate matter represented by the red line and NOx, or nitrogen oxides, represented by the blue line. And these emission standards have been tightened over time over the last 32 years, which you can kind of see on the slide. So as we talk about how to reduce diesel emissions in Oregon, one of the important things to keep in mind is that older diesel vehicles produce more pollution and greater harm to our communities. So when we regulate diesel or spend grant funds to reduce emissions, we're talking primarily about getting older vehicles and equipment off the road and out of service. Our goal is to promote the newer, cleaner burning or zero emissions options instead, which leads us to the Volkswagen settlement. Since 2009, the Volkswagen Group of America sold diesel passenger cars in the United States with emissions control defeat devices that violated federal emission standards. Software that was installed in 590,000 of those vehicles resulted in emissions of nitrogen oxides up to 40 times above the allowable limits. The resulting lawsuits against that scandal essentially were resolved in a partial consent decree against Volkswagen on behalf of the United States government and vehicle owners. The decree requires that Volkswagen provide more than $2.9 billion to an environmental mitigation fund to mitigate the previous and current excess nitrogen oxide emissions. And the initial allocation to the state of Oregon, based on our registration share of Volkswagen diesels, was $72.9 million to be spent over 10 years. So DEQ is required to retrofit or replace at least 450 school buses across the state with our first tranche of funding at a total expected cost of $18 to $22 million. Oregon will have approximately $40 million remaining out of the diesel settlement fund after administrative costs and the completion of our school bus project. So some of the key points regarding the use of Oregon's VW funds: these funds allow us to upgrade older, dirty diesel equipment to newer, cleaner burning and alternative fuel technologies to mitigate the impacts and the health outcomes. All vehicles and equipment must be eligible under the VW settlement, and they are summarized here on this slide. So these are the kinds of projects that we expect to see as a part of our work. And the diesel engines and vehicles must be scrapped and destroyed to qualify for replacement. Essentially, that's how we quantify success in the program, is we destroy an existing engine and a vehicle. And we can also fund exhaust control technologies to keep older equipment running longer and cleaner, so putting scrubbers on tailpipes. And Oregon must use all of the VW funds by October of 2027, or will be forced to return any unused dollars. So again, our priority with this is to get the older equipment off the road. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2007, which gives Oregon DEQ direction to create a grant program that will spend the remaining funds. We're going to be establishing the new program over the next 6 to 8 months, essentially, establishing project selection criteria and other requirements from the statute. The bill also regulates the use of diesel engines in the Portland metro area and sets up a process for clean diesel contracting standards among state agencies. It's also noteworthy that the City of Portland, Multnomah County, Metro Regional Government, the Port of Portland, and Washington County are all moving forward on their own clean diesel contracting standards. And I don't have details about that with me tonight, but I'm sure it'll come up in future conversations. So of note for the effort that you're undertaking here at the Portland Clean Energy Fund, House Bill 2007 prioritizes projects that are led by disadvantaged, minority-owned, women-owned, and service-disabled and veteran-owned and emerging small businesses. And it also includes a regional focus in Washington, Multnomah, and Clackamas counties in 2 specific ways. It regulates diesel engines in these areas and prioritizes funding for those regulated vehicles. And second, it prioritizes single truck replacement projects and retrofit projects in these areas. So we think this is an opportunity for potential overlap with proposals that you might see at the Portland Clean Energy Fund, and we'll be happy to work with you to help identify those opportunities. Over the next year, we're going to establish the rules, as I mentioned. I'll kind of speed through this. Thank you very much. DEQ will open a public comment period in the summer of 2020. The formal rulemaking process will be open to all who want to participate, and we expect our policymaking body, the Environmental Quality Commission, to take action in the fall with funds available in early 2021. And if possible, Katie, could you hand committee members the handout that I provided? And there are a couple on the back table as well for anyone who's interested. I'll just quickly walk through a case study of a project that we worked on with the Metropolitan Contractor Improvement Partnership. They're an African-American operated nonprofit that works with minority-owned contractors. Their job essentially is to improve and expand the contractor's capacity to work on projects. And in a partnership among Neighbors for Clean Air, which represented in the room, Environmental Protection Agency, and Oregon DEQ, this entity, MCIP, recently secured an $835,000 grant from EPA to clean up their diesel fleet. Some of the benefits and outcomes from that project are included on the slide here, as well as in the handout. And so I just want to close by inviting you all to, if you're interested, to follow up with us and explore opportunities where we might work together. Some of the medium-duty diesel fleets that are on the road today would be really likely candidates for electrification in the future. And so we could imagine a world where DEQ is going out and taking old diesel vehicles off the road. They're replacing their fleet with electric vehicles, and there may be an opportunity to install electric vehicle charging on site as a part of a joint project. So I'll just leave it at that and open it up for questions when we're done with the full panel.
Thank you, Garrick. So Huey is our last presenter and has no slides. Then we'll open it up for questions, a little Q&A after that, and ask Ingrid and Emma to grab a couple chairs and come up to the table as well.
I'll still try to be as entertaining as possible without any slides here. It is an honor to be in front of you all. My name is Hui Ong. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of OPAL Environmental Justice Oregon. I get a chance to talk a little bit about our work. OPAL's mission is to build power for environmental justice and civil rights in our communities. We define power by organizing people and organizing money, and the ability to control, create, and prevent change. So I think there's really great alignment with what the work we do and how actually PCEF and the resources that came here through the Portland Clean Energy Fund Initiative campaign are aligned. We actually build power by doing bus organizing. It's one of our core strategies. We get our community members on the buses to talk about their lived experiences and how important the system is to them, their needs, how it could be improved. We prioritize and focus on those that are directly impacted by environmental racism and low-income folks of color and people that are transit dependent. Through our organizing, we have been able to win significant victories in our communities. 30-minute increase in transfer times. We won the low-income fare that TriMet has rolled out in the past year that has seen over 30,000 folks registered onto that program, if not more. I hope I got those numbers right. And we have this vision of our transportation system as being a system that is free of fares, free of profiling, and free of congestion. And we're leading that campaign by, first incremental steps by building out a pathway to increase access to the system, like the expansion of Youth Pass. So the other areas where we organize is youth of color in East Portland through our Youth Environmental Justice Alliance. Our organizing is grounded in environmental justice principles. We believe that organizing gets the goods. It is a place where we transform and are able to talk about the lived experiences of those directly impacted by the structural and inequalities of how our system is actually built. It is one thing to get folks access to the system, but actually having folks understand how the system was initially built and understand the institutional racism that helps build, and I think folks have talked a little about some of the background. Centering frontline communities is a core piece of our strategy because we believe our communities ends up having the best solutions. We operate in a framework around a just transition. We know a transition is happening. That we're going to transition off of our current system and going to be into a more regenerative system, hopefully a regenerative system, but we don't know if that transition is going to be just. So having frontline communities lead it is pretty core and principled. We're super excited to talk a little bit about some of the visions of our work. We know that we need transit ridership to double in 20 years for even us to get close enough to the types of ridership and people participating in our public transportation system to have some impacts on our climate. And right now, currently, there actually is no plan in our transit agency to think about how to actually increase ridership. And we organize our communities around the issue because we want to fundamentally change leadership as well, because I think the leadership development that we are not just the recipients of the decisions people make, we actually want to end up becoming decision makers ourselves. Part of that role is the leadership development and having folks exposed to campaign and running and being able to understand how organizing and directly engaging in the schools, on the buses, and in our communities is vital. As we know, transportation is not a silo issue. We fundamentally believe that transportation justice is core to climate justice as well as environmental justice. And when we look at how our community is getting pushed further and further out of the central core, how we are thinking about investments with the resources like from PCEF, invest in grounds people's resiliency in community. I offer that we have started thinking about what does resiliency hubs look like in the communities that we're actually trying to organize. Because we know it's not just about access to a system for the transportation system, it's actually access to kind of the decision-making bodies and also finding resilient hubs and actually being able to have folks have centers that are part of how people gather and come together to both learn and train and also build community. Something that we hope folks get a chance to explore with us. We know that community-based organizations also are being displaced in the central core, and even we were displaced out of 42nd and Division when I first started as the executive director, and a dispensary moved in, offered the landlord 3 times the rent, and we were asked to move in 30 days. So our organizing ended up on 82nd, and we know that there's increases of those challenges in our communities. So when you think about supporting resources for those that are doing transportation justice work that has direct impacts on our climate goals, think about the other types of influences that those organizations face. In addition to that, I would also offer that as a person that works with grant makers, oftentimes, there's a chance here to do something different and not to exacerbate some of the heteronormative, like white patriarchy systems of like how to administer. I think the way this committee was built was super amazing, and I value all your time, and I'm super excited that you all are here representing different sectors and experiences. And with that, I have other ideas, and we'll open up for questions for folks, but just excited to be here to represent and share some of the voices of transit-dependent folks that has the intersections of both dismantling institutions that have historically been built to actually exclude people from decision-making bodies to actually have folks at the table.
Thank you. So we are at about time, but I think that we can take 10 or 15 minutes since we have so many folks here from the transportation sector. We want to take advantage of that, and then after that, close the conversation, and then if there is a need for follow-up from the committee or an additional conversation, we can schedule that at a later time. But I'd ask Emma and Ingrid if you could BYOC, bring your own chair to the table, then, and if there are any committee members that have questions or comments.
Yeah.
Down to Katie. Give you the keys there.
Special buttons.
Good to see you.
There have to be some questions or comments, because that was a lot of effort. That just happened.
All this expectation.
I have like lots of questions, but I might email each of you. Quick question for Garrick. Does DEQ have like a calculator, if you will, in terms of like how you calculate some of your project outcomes on greenhouse gas reductions or CO2 emissions? I'm thinking really from the broader public, potential applicants who will have to try to calculate these on their own. Just wondering and curious if DEQ has that tool.
There's a really easy to use tool at the Environmental Protection Agency's website. It's called the Diesel Emissions Quantifier. Anyone can log in, create an account for free, and start mocking up the impacts of projects, with the only sort of caveat being that it's really focused on the toxic properties of diesel emissions, and it's not great at calculating the carbon emissions benefits of different projects. So we don't need to go into those weeds, but the diesel emissions quantifier is helpful, and there are other more sort of comprehensive tools that are a little harder to use, but they're available as well.
Thank you. And then I think for our community groups, just kind of curious, I know there was some feedback for us as grant makers to sort of think what could be different. And I know you've raised a concern around how we sort of think about the wage standard, but just curious if there's any other feedback. And Hugh, I know you alluded to some potential feedback as well, but just kind of curious while you're here if there's any feedback as we sort of shape and develop what this grant making process could look like.
I'll answer while Hui's momentarily distracted. I think I didn't say quite all the words that I had up on my slide, but thinking about whether you can support programs that are doing existing good work, especially initially thinking about whether there's a way for the committee to fund some of the time that it takes people to develop new proposals if you are asking for new proposals and new partnerships and all of that. Someone suggested to me this afternoon, and I said, oh, that's a good idea, but it's not in my slideshow. The idea of having performance-based measures, like say, like, hey, I like what you're doing with Yeja, Opal. I'm gonna give you money to do more and better, and if you show me that you have done more and better, I'll give you even more money. But you know, like, can you look at great things that people are doing and say, I want to support more of that. Here's some money. Go forth and do your best thinking of how you can best amplify it. Because us like trying to figure out what you want in order to write a proposal is not always our best thinking of how to achieve the community benefit. It's our best thinking of what we think you understand and know and want to hear. And so the model of can we trust our community partners? Can we, like, you know, make fewer hoops and more collaboration is an alternate model.
How do you like double down on things that work? And also be mindful that there are pockets of the city that don't have hubs and don't have actually folks organizing in those communities. I was at a meeting just the other day where there was 4 community translators that were talking about the upcoming bond, and like they didn't know anything about the low-income fare. They didn't know anything. They had limited access because of language barriers around how to even write a system safely and how to get on and off. And there's no plan to engage, a lot of these different, non-English speaking communities. And there's no like nonprofit, right, that is like holding that space down to help support that. So as you're mapping out the city and you're mapping where the grants are going, also thinking about asking a question of who's actually not being attended to, because our communities are pretty diverse.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions, comments? Shanice?
What's up, y'all? Thank you very much for sharing the good work, and so excited to see Hui among all of these good people. I think I'm in a space of, we're talking about walking, cycling, public transit, electric vehicles. In the back of my mind, the transportation bond is in my head, and as we're making sense of what is going to create the most and most valuable impact for folks of color in this community, which is the most feasible, that's a weird question, but I'm thinking about public transit and my own bias and what that means to strategically focus on increasing ridership and increasing access to and then in places that might not be right now in terms of bus lines. So I don't know what that looks like with in terms of our possibilities here in the body to think strategically, especially with other conversations. But yeah, that's what's on my mind.
Thank you. Maria?
Thanks everyone for all your presentations. This question is for anyone, but particularly thinking about public agencies who can hopefully answer some of this or get that conversation started for us. I'm curious to hear from you. What is the outlook for funding for the community-oriented programs that you shared? We know there's a fuel tax, heavy vehicle tax, cannabis tax, all kinds of other sources of funding. How sustainable are those for the programs that you are sharing that are centered on community? And where's PCEF really going to make the most impact in continuing to boost some of those community programs? And how can public agencies continue to invest? I want to hear from Community Cycling and Opal as well on that, because I want to know what money is out there and what can we do to continue boosting some of those resources or leveraging that.
I'll start, but I won't have anything like a complete answer. I'm still navigating the process of establishing rules for the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, and one of the things that our agency's been really focused on is recognizing the technical capacity that it takes to bring a complete grant application to the table, and that some of the businesses, frankly, that we're hoping to be working with may not have the kind of complex information about their fleet or even know about the funding opportunities. So how do we make sure that some of our resources are available for technical assistance and support? And how do we make sure that our grant applications are open to multi-party applicants that include community-based organizations with dedications of a portion of that funding for the capacity of somebody at that table to sit down and do the grant-based work, and then we could take the majority of the dollars and get the air quality benefit. That's a very paltry answer compared to the scale of the conversation that's happening in transportation every day, when we have big public sector partners talking about raising tons of transportation revenue and then saying, well, these sources of funding are going to be limited to expenditures inside the road right-of-way, when really what we need are some of the results that we can see from the programs that people deliver to people and help change behavior and reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. But
just to comment on the EV space, I think, so the utilities are making huge investments. They are currently asking for legislative approval to be able to use taxpayer funds to fund some of these EV charging infrastructure investments. And they are actually prioritizing nonprofits for funding. One of the things that I think is a barrier for nonprofits in this space is that you need to have a fully baked proposal with technical expertise. And that is oftentimes lacking in the staff of community organizations. And so potentially giving some funding to be able to set organizations up to be able to receive other funding.
And I'll add my 2 cents with a disclaimer that I have not been with PBOT very long, and as I mentioned, I kind of wear multiple hats, and so I know there are other smarter PBOT colleagues here who I will look to after I say this to see what I get wrong. But I'll say kind of 3 high-level comments that I've observed and working at the Bureau. And the first is there is just a long-term viability question hovering over all of transportation funding. It's a good problem to have, because as we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, that's a good thing. But that also poses challenges when we have a transportation funding system that is funded largely through taxes on gasoline. And so that is kind of one long-term trend we need to be aware of when we think about what is available for our transportation agencies to spend. The second is something that kind of alludes to what Sam was talking about at the beginning, that there's certain portions of the PCEF on a very small percentage, but that are subject to something called the Highway Trust Fund, and this is a constitutional restriction on how certain monies that are revenues generated can be spent, and those are pretty strict limitations. And so when we talk about kind of creative, innovative programming opportunities, that can really limit it. If it's a strict definition of what can be spent in the right-of-way, that limits us. And the third thing I would say is again, kind of anecdotally, I know there have been some challenges as our government agencies are going on a journey of realizing how we have to do this with a focus on transportation justice and the wisdom we need to learn from our community. We are butting up against a system that hasn't always been built on partnership, hasn't always looked for opportunities to form partnerships between government and community. And as we kind of push that culture change, we run up against hurdles of bureaucracies that weren't set up that way. And I think there have been challenges in government being able to capacitate and truly partner with community organizations just because of those hurdles. I noticed Irene Marion, our equity and inclusion manager, is back there, and she is really leading the charge at PBOT for helping us come up with innovative ways to work around that. But it's just a reality that we aren't always able to capacitate our partners and in the ways we need to because of those hurdles. And PBOT staff, if I got anything wrong, please chime in.
Around the Fixing Our Streets proposal that is on the ballot in May. Sure thing. I did. Yeah. Thank you. Is that as you may have seen, that's a very focused set of projects that have been identified that are focused on safety and maintenance projects. And so while that's going to be crucially important to our ability to provide a safe, usable system, it isn't one that is going to be particularly available to new programming in this particular context. And then the regional measure that I think you also inquired about, in addition to the projects that are being defined there, there's also looking at a set of programming opportunities that could be significantly funded. I think, if I'm accurate, about $50 million a year potentially is what's being looked at. That's still in development this spring, so an opportunity to sort of see where that's developing, and could think of that as a leverage opportunity, perhaps, again, interacting between the regional context and then the city context, of course. So I just wanted to add that specific set of information.
Thank you. Huey, did you have anything to add to Maria's question?
Yeah, I think sometimes it is a little challenging when resources come from some of the government bodies, knowing that oftentimes they're also the decision-making bodies that we actually want to have impact. And I think one of the things that I would love to explore a little bit about some of the innovations is how do you actually, right? One of the things we're doing is we're creating future transit justice leaders, right, in our work, because they see the intersections of this work as it relates to racial justice, as it relates to climate justice, and they're going to impact the policy. And when we think about something like the Highway Trust Fund, is there some forward-thinking conversations that could explore what it means to invest in organizations that actually have a long-term plan to actually bust the trust? And I'll say it, right, that's something that we fundamentally believe is a strategy that's necessary, given that the revenue coming in from a regressive tax has such limitations and enables such small thinking in terms of what those resources go to. What could this committee do to stretch to think about supporting organizations that run campaigns?
Can you clarify, are you saying that we should think about investments in advocacy-related work and not necessarily infrastructure or tangible, delivered programs as we've traditionally seen in the transportation realm?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think the advocacy organizing actually ends up building some of the tangible stuff because they are able to access, maybe not these resources, but they're able to access other resources from other places. We're seeing the investments in our engagement around the measure that's coming up in the fall, and I think it has significantly shifted because of direct organizing that's happened from directly impacted communities.
Randpiece and then Faith, and I think we want to try and wrap it up in the next 5 to 7 minutes. So Randpiece?
Yeah, I don't expect an answer now, but it would be great for folks from BBOT if we can get workforce data around construction, both on the contracting and the workforce piece. Just kind of wondering how dollars are currently being spent and what the utilization rates are. And would love to see any updates around PBOT around its own adoption of an EV fleet, and if you have any thoughts around any plans for what training looks like for the mechanic side and any workforce equity components. So I think I think, yeah.
Just in terms of the city generally and our adoption, so we're in the middle of trying to figure out our own walk our talk transportation decarbonization plan. Right now we have about 32% of our sedan fleet is converted to electric vehicles. And so we're trying to figure out what that trajectory looks like. In terms of, right now we're kind of at the point where we're like, we shouldn't be purchasing sedans that are not electric unless there's a real good reason for it. And besides undercover police cars, I don't think there really is a great reason to not do that. So, and then just trying to figure out what does that look like in terms of heavy duty and other types of vehicles. What your other question was about? Training mechanics. Yeah, and I think that needs to be part of the plan that we're looking into. Like, what does this mean in terms of jobs, and specifically, mechanic and fleet-related jobs at the city specifically? Is that what your question was about, or is it at large?
Yeah, I think it is. I think mainly about the city, and this is just like a broader aspect. As I hear, like there's a bike mechanic program, and I imagine as different groups think about their own innovation, I generally think of different career pathways. For some, the city is a destination. So I kind of wonder where the city is putting its own investments around workforce training in emerging technologies such as electric vehicles.
Yep. And that's a great thing to be thinking about as we're doing our decarbonization planning. So thank you for that.
And I just say, it's a great question. It's absolutely something we're thinking about. When we put up that slide about workforce development opportunities and sort of pre-apprenticeship programs, it's something we've heard interest from the community and interest from within the Bureau itself. So I think it's a model we'd really like to explore. And we will get back to you on that data around current workforce contracting and other things.
Faith?
Thank you all for the great information. I hopefully absorbed a little percentage of what you shared with me tonight. It's all new for me. Thank you. I definitely see our role as organizing power, and I think that's about organizing people. And one of the things that I was sitting listening to all of your presentations was thinking about just the role of the city or bureaucracy in general. So the county government agencies, the state government agencies, but particularly the city government agencies, what are you doing? And do we have a concerted effort that's related to PCEF opportunity to be out in community, seeding ideas or listening for that innovation so that we can coordinate, right? Like this is a weaving opportunity for us all to be doing. And I don't know if there is a concerted effort and plan for each of the bureaus to be out in community saying, we've heard these great ideas. What other great ideas do you have? Do you know there's this PCEF opportunity coming? So I'm curious about that.
It's a great question and absolutely something we want to do. So when we think about the roles, we've had internal conversations about what role can PBOT play in supporting the goals of PCEF. It was that question we had up on the slide. And one of the biggest ideas we think one of the biggest things we've talked about is that we have existing relationships and we are happy to provide those kind of seed ideas with the understanding that the community has so many more ideas than we could ever provide. We also think that we could provide some technical assistance and some expertise, both in the grant development portion, but also potentially to carry through some of these partnerships. And on that workforce side, absolutely, a lot of the good transportation jobs in the city of Portland are at the city of Portland. So all those things. The other thing I would just say is I kind of, and I really loved Cassandra's kind of frankness of feedback. I think there has been some confusion over what the nexus between PCEF and transportation is. And because of that kind of ambiguity, there's been a little bit of hesitancy of sort of on the community side and on the PBOT side of sort of not wanting to get out ahead of our skis, not wanting to go too far, but we're really kind of watching this space and looking for your direction on how we can be helpful partners and what kind of that technical assistance, the partnership support, the resource support we could provide. So we're really excited to hear from you how you'd like us to show up.
So Katie, one more thing on that, and I think this is for PCEF staff, is just to I encourage you to think about, or ask us to think about, is there actually a capacity for grant writing that's in each of the city bureaus that community members could go to? And I don't know what, I haven't thought about that legally and all of those things, but it feels like that is a possibility for bureaus to play a role there.
Though, do you want to go?
I mean, we will find a time at some point here in one of the next agendas to speak to you about our efforts around technical assistance, capacity building. We are gearing up to develop grant writing workshops. So, but that there's going to be an evolution, and we're going to have to tease out what that actually looks like and how that evolves over time to get at, I think, some of the points you're talking about, and figure out how we do it in a way that meets all the needs that we're going to need to meet. Absolutely, and there's an eagerness within the city to support this, and so we have been able to pull in, there's certainly conversations within the Bureau of Environmental Services around how they can be equally technical support providers as well. So it's going to take us a minute to figure out what that looks like, but it's certainly something we've got our eyes to.
All right. Thank you. And thank you also. I was distracted by these really cute kittens that are happening over here on this video. So thank you all for coming and sticking with us and staying late on this night and for this meeting. And I'm sure we'll have follow-up with you in the future. Committee members, I would ask you guys to kind of stand up, stretch. If you need to use the restroom, do that, and then meet us over here in this corner in 2 minutes so that we can get going with our work session.
Thank you.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you. I do want to say again, thank you all for your service. Like, I realize this is a ton of your time for a long time, and thank you all.
And for those in the audience, you're welcome to sit around, but we're going to go into work session. So we won't be sitting at these mics, but we will go into work session over here. So it's feel free to sit around and observe, but we won't be at these mics.